personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a very special guest on the show, Victoria Beckman. She is the Associate General Counsel of Security and Privacy at Shopify. Hello.
Hi, Debbie. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to finally make it here.
Yeah, well, you're fascinating. I follow you for many years. I follow your trajectory for many years from your time being at law firms. I think you're at Frost Brown, your time at Microsoft, and now at Shopify. You know, you're always putting out very helpful information around cyber and privacy. You have very unique background, in my view, because you dealt in the past with things like cybercrime and stuff like that. So I think you have a very interesting lens that you look through. Also, you and I had the pleasure of being on a list, I think in 2022, like the top 50 cyber influencers. People throw me into cyber for some reason, a lot of times. But why don't you tell us, why is this career path for you? How did you come to be where you are right now? Just interesting to me.
Well, thanks for all those words, nice words. And I also don't like the word influencer, by the way. I don't think I'm an influencer or anything, but it was kind of luck and circumstances. Before being an attorney, I was an engineer, and I like the technical aspect of systems, and I did a minor in information systems, so it's something that I liked. When I was in law school, I wanted to be a public defender, and my heart was into being a public defender. And after law school, I went to do that. I loved it, and I thought I was going to be doing that for the rest of my life. But then life happened, and I got married, and I moved to Ohio with my family. And there I had to go back to private practice because there wasn't any job as a public defender. It wasn't really even by choice. So I went back to a firm, and the first firm that I went to was very small. There were only 5-6 attorneys. A case that was conflicted out of a big firm came in, and it involved a hacker and money and funds that had been transferred to China. But the case was already in the kind of like late stages. So all the forensics, everything had been done. And they thought, well, you're an engineer, you will understand this. They gave me the case. I didn't understand absolutely anything, but I really liked the topic. And I thought, if I'm going to be at a firm, this is something that I can actually enjoy and that I can learn more about. So I decided to just start reading about it, start looking into any classes or conferences and things like that. And then it became kind of organic that people said, oh, well, you know about cyber or privacy. And they started giving me cases, and that became my practice.
Wow, that's interesting. I think there's a theme here. When I see people who have very unique career paths, they find something's really interesting. They go out of their way to really pursue that. And then you basically made a name for yourself in that area, which is amazing. Thank you for that. How is it that you found yourself into going from law firms into corporations?
It was also luck, like pretty much everything I feel in my life. I was not looking for a job, and I didn't think I could move from Ohio because of our family situation. So I was working at the firm, and a recruiter from Microsoft approached me. Initially, they told me the job has to be done, the person has to move to Florida. And I say, well, thanks, but no thanks. And then a few months later, they reached out and said, we're looking for a very specific profile because in that particular position, they wanted somebody who was bilingual, Spanish and English, because I was covering the Americas, who had a JD and a license in the United States, because historically they had foreign trained attorneys doing that and that knew about cyber. And that's not necessarily an easy combination to find. So we started talking, and they said, well, you don't have to move right away. And we were in the middle of the pandemic and everything. And finally, when I accepted the job, I said, okay, fine, I'll move. So I ended up moving to Florida right away. But that's really how it came about.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm sure they saw what we all see. You're incredibly helpful, incredibly well versed in these areas. And I think you communicate really well in terms of being able to send that message to all types of audiences because, you're not just talking to legal people, you're talking to business people and trying to understand how your expertise fits within a business. So I think that's really cool. What's happening in privacy or cyber right now that's concerning you? Like, what are you seeing maybe in the news or something? You're saying, oh, wow, I don't like the direction this is going.
Well, I don't think necessarily I have an opinion as to I don't like the direction this is going, but we are pretty concerned with AI and the uses and implications of AI in both privacy and cybersecurity. I think any technology is not good or bad. I think there are amazing use cases for AI. I think it's going to help make things efficient. There are a lot of positives, but also because it's new technology and we don't know what could happen, there are a lot of unintended consequences. And it's the same way that it's helping us, for example, do defense of systems. It's also helpful for attackers to use it to attack and to scale their attacks, to make it a little bit more complex and sophisticated. The fact that there is not much legislation and that is new, but it is already being used at a massive scale. All of that is very interesting to me. It's just interesting to see what could happen, what we can do to prepare, what the legislatures will come up with, knowing that maybe by the end of anyone drafting a legislation, probably the technology is already way far advanced where we started. So that topic is something that I'm concerned or interested in learning.
Yeah, I share your concern there. We've always seen technology outpaces law and regulation, right? Because it tends to be very reactive. But I think the difference now with things like AI is that there's just an exponential growth there of those use cases, and it's hard to pin that down. So I think that gap between innovation and regulation is getting a lot wider and is going a lot faster, I think, in the future.
Right. And it's also accessible to everybody, which I think is a good thing. But obviously, that will also bring consequences because when something like that is open for any purpose, for people with any intentions or any training, it could be, there's a lot of room for error and for uses that we don't want to be used to. But at the same time, again, I'm a fan of having technology and access to everybody and being creative and using technology for good causes.
I want your thoughts, just some general executive advice around working with different groups of people, right? Because when you wear a legal hat, if you're in a law firm, your business is law, right? But if you're in a corporation, their business is whatever it is that the corporation does, and then you're a part of helping them do that. So, how have you found collaboration with groups who are outside of the legal sphere in organizations?
Well, I think that's something that I'm still working on and that I will probably work for the rest of my career. It was a difficult transition to come from a law firm to a corporation because no one teaches you in law school how to deal with that and what you have to do to know your clients, your internal clients, and the organization to know that you're even there. But in general, my approach to this and everything really is I try to be as not only approachable, but explain things as I wouldn't say simple, but in a way that I think the receiver of that message will understand. So when you talk about, for example, the information that I post, is really it came out of the fact that I'm a visual learner. I like charts, I like tables. And so I started doing them for myself. And I figured they are useful to me. Maybe they will be useful to other people. If there are people who don't find it valuable, that's completely fine. But I learned, I learned like that. And so in the same way, I think when approaching teams in the organization that way, trying to put myself in their shoes, because that's a huge difference. When you're outside counsel, it's a little bit more based on theory. It's kind of the law says this, but when you're in a business in real life, when you have to consider whether you have the resources, what the consequences for the rest of the business will be, the appetite for risk, and all kinds of considerations, I try to put myself in their shoes and be creative and say, well, we have to achieve this point. We have to comply by doing X. So if we cannot get there perfectly, what can we do? Where can we meet in the middle? Is there a different option, maybe a temporary option? And I think when people know that you're just not an attorney coming to say you have to do this, they're willing to work with you and collaborate, because at the end of the day, everybody wants to get to a good solution. I'm accustomed to working with engineers, and I have I don't know. I think still a lot like an engineer, and so I feel I have good skills in being able to interpret or translate what laws say for those more technical teams.
Right. And then I think the thing that you're doing that is really bridging the gap is that you understand a lot around the mechanics and the operational side of what these teams need to do. So it goes beyond the theory of the law, but just trying to think about, so how do we achieve this in our organization with the people that we have, with the tools that we have at our disposal, right?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a matter of being pretty creative.
Let's talk about cyber and privacy. Maybe people in the US confuse it more than most, right? I feel like sometimes, even at the policy level, a lot of times when people are talking about cyber, when they get into detail, like, oh, well, that part is privacy, this part is cyber. So tell me your thought about the difference in cyber and privacy and how they interact or intersect.
Well, I think the elevator speech that everybody gives is privacy is about access to authorized access to information. So you already collected the information, or you're going to collect that information, and you just need to know who can have access to that, and you control that. And cyber is more unauthorized access to information and how you protect that information that you already collected from an outside or even an internal attacker. That's kind of the main difference. In reality, there is a lot of interaction because, for example, a lot of the privacy laws, if not all of them, will say, well, you have the obligation to keep this information protected. And so that's where you kind of inject this cyber component saying, in order to keep this protected, we have to have, I don't know, multi-factor authentication. We have to have passwords that meet certain requirements. We have to do all of that. So they do work together in a way. But as I often explain within the organization, not every incident that could be considered a cyber incident is necessarily a privacy incident or something that we have to worry in terms of notifying or there was personal information, because you can be attacked and just not have your systems available without necessarily being any exfiltration of data. So I think it's normal and understandable for people to get those two confused, but I do see it as a separate thing. in my mind, privacy has the component, a huge component that is privacy compliance and the laws. And do you have your data inventories for GDPR? Do you know how to respond to data subject requests? Those kinds of things that we don't deal as much with in cyber, because in cyber we are concerned with incident response, with whether or not we have the technical requirements that we need to comply to keep that information secure, but also sometimes we have contractual obligations to notify within a certain amount of time. So it's all in there.
Now, what's your thoughts about security questionnaires or privacy questionnaires that go out to organizations? I feel like with all the new regulations around cyber and privacy that are coming up, maybe I can't imagine there'll be more than the 200 questionnaire. Maybe we add 50 more questions there. How do you see organizations be able to try to navigate that in terms of figuring out what their third-party risk would be?
Well, I really can't speak for any organization, but what I see or what I have seen is we do have, for example, a Shopify, and just let's make clear that I'm not speaking for my employer, it's my own opinion, but we do have a questionnaire. It's not that long, and we really use it to evaluate, vendors that we have and how to do the onboarding. It doesn't mean necessarily that we say, oh no, you don't comply with this. And because there's also not, just like in privacy, there's not a federal law necessarily that says you have to have this system and this firewall and this, and this. So a lot of times we could just ask or accommodate or something like that. But it is very useful in cases, for example, when we are outsourcing certain functions and the employees of the third-party company are going to have access to our systems. That's when those questionnaires are critical, because we want to make sure that not only they comply, they have the documentation, they provide their SOC documentation, ISO, and that they're aligned with our own systems. Because we all know that when it comes to liability, at the end of the day, if there is an attack or something, we can say, oh no, it wasn't us, it was X vendor that we hire. So I find them useful. I don't necessarily think they have to be that long, because I think you could cover the main areas, and then depending on the vendor or the third party, you can emphasize. If, for example, you're hiring or getting a vendor for artificial intelligence, you can emphasize in whether or not the information is going to be used for their training of their systems, all kinds of very particular things to each vendor.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm hoping to see more common sense in that area, because I've seen some questionnaires, it just really didn't fit what the third party was actually doing, right? Because, like you said, if you have someone who's doing a critical part of something you're outsourcing, you may have different questions for that company, other than maybe there's a vendor that supplies you something that has 5 employees. Like, would you ask them for a SOC 2 audit or something? I mean, I've seen like all the spectrum of this, and some of it just doesn't make sense in some ways. But I think
I have a feeling people say that attorneys ruin all the fun, and I have a feeling this is one of those cases where attorneys were like, oh, let's send them 300 questions because we cover ourselves by being able to say later, well, we asked for this and for that. But that doesn't mean that they're necessary or fun to deal with.
One trend that I'm seeing, and I'm hoping that I see more of this, I see some corporations that I work with, they're coming up with things like codes of conduct that are saying, this is the way that we handle our systems. You agree that you're going to align with this. So they're not saying, oh, 5-person company, you have to have a SOC 2 type 2 audit or something like that. They're saying, hey, this is the realm in which you need to work in. This is how we think that you should handle data and stuff like that. What is your thought about using a code of conduct to help in that process?
Well, I'm a big proponent of doing anything within the limits of the law and to be compliant, but doing what works for the organization. Because again, one thing is what the laws say, a very different thing is when you are in real life and you have limited amount of resources or you have to deal with all kinds of vendors. So those kind of conduct may work. It is hard to do them at a scale when you're dealing with different vendors of different organizations and for very different systems. Because in our case, for example, yes, a code of conduct may work and a lot of the vendors may say, yes, we will comply with that. But if you're negotiating with big companies, providers of, I don't know, cloud services, all kinds of things, you're going to have to, one, likely you're going to have to deal with their own terms. And two, if you have any kind of negotiation power, it's not going to be just a code of conduct that we agree to follow. So they could be, I mean, it doesn't have to be black and white. It could be a good solution for certain vendors or in certain areas or certain products and kind of live in harmony with other types of agreements.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's very common sense.
Yeah, because if you're evaluating like, I don't know, a vendor that is going to provide the food for your cafeteria or something is kind of silly to say, give us your son, give us your but then saying you follow kind of these very general parameters and this is our code of conduct. Cool.
I want to talk a bit about supply chain cybersecurity. There was something you posted about that recently. I thought was really cool, but also I think that there's more talk in just the industry in general around supply chain. And I think maybe some of this came about, maybe it's always been there, right? A lot of people started talking about it more after that SolarWinds hack came because they were like, hey, who are we using? What are they doing? It's more than third-party risk. So thinking about supply chain is very different. So are you seeing more people talk more about supply chain cybersecurity?
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, obviously those things existed and have existed for a long time, but I think SolarWinds was a good wake-up call. I also think that things like the Colonial Pipeline and even the war in Ukraine have raised some awareness to the public that those like the supply chain critical infrastructure is so important because you can have probably worse consequences sometimes of having an attack to those, a supply chain attack that attacks multiple critical systems than even a physical war. So I do think people are talking a little bit more about them because they're seeing the potential consequences of it. And I think I at least assume good intent people. I think people are thinking about those. They're trying to set their security systems to avoid those kinds of attacks, but there are fairly sophisticated and is sometimes it's very difficult to have one control of all everybody involved in the supply chain and it's costly as well. So Yes, I think it has seen an increase on the talk about that, but it's not like people are freaking out. At least I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I haven't seen that either. I want your thoughts about this mind shift. Hopefully, this mind shift that either is happening or should be happening around cyber. And for me, the mind shift is in the past, some people thought about cybersecurity almost like the fire department. So it's like, oh, we don't have to do anything about it until something bad happens, and then people are going to spring into action, right? And then the other one is the idea that somehow your organization is like a castle and all you're doing is protecting the castle and keeping threats out of the castle, but we know that threats are in the castle, right? And this goes again to supply chain as well, where you can't just think about the exterior threats. You have to think about the internal threats. And also I tell people, don't think about things in like a Mission Impossible way, like someone's hanging from the ceiling, trying to get in your computer systems. Threat, whether it's malicious or not, is still a threat, right? So tell me your thoughts about this mindset of going from a reactive cyber posture to proact. Are we getting there?
Well, first, I think it would be awesome if there were people dropping from the ceiling and we can. I think that would be a pretty cool job. But I do see a really good trend, a positive trend in that that mentality has changed a lot in the last 10 years. I mean, the last, I would say maybe 4 or 5 years, I think people are getting it. And it is hard for organizations sometimes because like all of us humans, we have a tendency to like kind of immediate results. And so it is difficult to explain to a board of directors or to a C-suite that we have to invest a lot of money now to prevent something that may happen in the future. It is kind of one of those things that I feel like all of us learn from our mistakes. And it's one of those things that anyone that has gone through a major incident understands now the importance of being prepared and that they should have done something before. But when it's kind of an abstract concept, it's harder to get your mind into that. I do think though that this kind of famous or infamous attacks and the fact that there's been enforcement by the SEC, the FTC, and those kinds of things has definitely opened the eyes of a lot of board of directors, and there are more requirements about how the C-suites, the board of directors have to be a little bit more savvy to at least, they don't have to go and figure out and mitigate the actual, let's say in the case of a data breach, but they have to be a little bit more savvy as to this happens, it happens to every organization. These are the consequences. It's not only the cost, but the reputational cost, the fact that your production may be stopped for days, that you may never get the information back. So I do think that is a great shift. There's a lot of work to do, but and I don't know how to really balance that well because I'm not a fan of scaring people to death and being like, oh, you're going to be attacked and this but also sometimes I feel like unless people see those crazy scenarios, they don't believe it. So it's kind of a balance that we have to deal with. But I'm pretty optimistic. Well, I'm pretty optimistic in general, but in this case, I'm also pretty optimistic that people are getting there and understanding why we care so much.
I agree. And I think that is a really tough balance because I also don't like to scare people like, oh my God, the sky is falling, right? Even though the sky could fall, part of that balance is, in a way, I feel like people who do the scaremongering, they do scaremongering on like fringe things. You know what I mean? Like the most extreme, ridiculous scenario, just like the Mission Impossible thing. So if you're thinking about the Mission Impossible thing, you're not thinking about the person who has their password taped on their monitor. You know what I'm saying? Where that's probably more likely. to happen. And that's like the less sexy threat, right, that you have. Even it's so funny because I do CLE classes with attorneys and stuff like that. And it's so funny because when I do things about insider threats, they almost always talk about like a disgruntled employee. I'm like, that's so fringe, right? You may see an article in the newspaper about that, but insider threats are not malicious. They're not like a disgruntled employee or whatever. It's some mistake maybe that happens, someone maybe who doesn't have training, maybe there's some type of gap in the way that you do your system or whatever, and it may not be malicious. So if you're focusing on that scenario, you're missing like the majority of what an insider threat could be. What are your thoughts?
Yes, and in a way, I guess not to give credit to the bad actors, but but yes, I have to give credit that they're pretty good. So when there's social engineering, some of those emails you cannot tell that they are fake. It's impossible. Sometimes people may have the training, but they have their little notebook where they write down every password and everything because they don't. So I do think that there are, not to make it a Mission Impossible level, but there are risks that are not as sexy as the other ones. And so people don't really consider them the same way that they don't think that they could be a risk because they're like, well, I'm just, putting my password, doing my job or something like that. And you're right, a lot of it is unintentional, but regardless, the consequences could be very serious, despite the fact that the person may have had the best intentions in the world. So I think the awareness, that's why it's so important. The awareness has to be at all levels. It's not just here, CEO of the company, we may be attacked like solar winds, is everybody think of your personal life, think of what you do and be aware, because even in personal lives, when we're talking about cybersecurity, it affects all of us. So even in your personal life, if someone takes advantage of someone else because they take their bank account, they send them some email, they sometimes abuse elderly people. So I think the awareness has to be for everybody and has to be in a way that they can relate. I cannot relate to an attack where they stole millions of dollars because I don't have millions of dollars. But if I hear of some kind of scam with something, I don't know, Starbucks, then maybe I will fall for that.
Women in tech. I'm very much a proponent of this. I think there are quite a few women in privacy. It's probably more women than men, I think, in privacy. But I think that happened because when privacy wasn't a hot issue, a lot of the guys didn't want to do it. So when it became a hot issue, like, hey, here we are. But we definitely need more women. We need more people of color in these areas. We need more people that are visible and can do like us, speaking, being able to share information because the threats and the problems that we have in society as it relates to privacy and cyber, it impacts all of us, and all of us have a different lens in which to look through, and then also the risks are different for all of us. So what are your thoughts about that?
Oh, Debbie, we can't sit here all day when we're talking about this because I agree. I mean, I think cyber is different in that regard. When we're talking about diversity, cyber is very different than the behavior that we have seen in privacy. And obviously, I 100% think that teams have to be diverse, that there's going to be diversity of gender, diversity of race, of cultures, of all kinds of, anyone will benefit from having a diverse team. And historically, it just hasn't been an environment that is very welcoming to women. And so it's not necessarily an easy position to be in. It is very common for me to be in meetings and in rooms where I'm the only woman, let alone the only Latina. I can pretty much count them in one hand. And so that's why, at least for me, is very important to be a role model, to open doors, and to welcome those people into the industry. I feel that I feel representation is very important. Number one, if we don't see anyone that looks and sounds like us, it's going to be very hard for us to imagine that we can become, achieve those roles in higher positions. And also, unless there is somebody that is trying to be welcoming and said, you can fit here, and I went through all these obstacles, let's make sure you don't go through those, and you encourage, then we will, if there are more of us, then we will make that a collective effort, and people will feel more welcome. So I think it's kind of a snowball effect. In my case, my people often ask me my goals or my motivations, and to be honest, my motivation has never been to be this or do this or have this title. But in the last maybe 5-6 years, I realized the importance of going higher up in that corporate ladder because of the importance of that representation, and I'm breaking those barriers so that I can welcome other people. But I think it's work that all of us have to do. I mean, it shouldn't be on like the burden of the person trying to break into the industry. It should be all of us in the industry, obviously, men or people with different backgrounds, and we need it. We definitely need it. It is a given that if you have people with different perspectives, people who have had different experiences are going to think of things that someone else may not. So, for example, if I'm not blind, I'm probably not thinking every single day about things that are an obstacle in my life, and I won't bring it up when we're thinking about security or a product, because it's just not something that is constant in my life. But if we have a diverse team and there's someone like that, for example, we'll raise, well, what about if someone is blind? What about if someone is this? What about if someone doesn't have this experience? So I think it's important. I think I will say it until I die. And on my part, I try to welcome people and be approachable and encourage them that, yes, women, minorities, everybody can be in this industry. There is room for everybody.
That's amazing. Thank you. And I agree with that wholeheartedly, especially as we're moving into a lot of these AI systems. These AI systems, we're seeing problems with AI systems that are developed with a narrow scope of people. And then you try to push it on other people who don't fit that criteria, and it just doesn't work that way. So I think, especially as we're seeing people trying to use AI for more use cases that could be harmful, I'm very concerned about that. So it's that diversity of thought and people, and because it impacts all of us, I think we need people in just every area, right? And I want to see people from all walks of life to be involved in privacy and involved in cyber. So I think that's really important. So if it were the world according to you, Victoria, and we did everything you said, what would be your wish for either cyber or privacy anywhere in the world, whether it be law, technology, human behavior? What are your thoughts?
I haven't thought about that. Well, as a segue to this conversation, my ideal world would have a very diverse workforce in privacy, in cybersecurity, and in everything for that matter, to reflect a little bit better what real life is. Also, in an ideal world, people will be a little bit more aware of why we care so much about cybersecurity, the potential consequences, the sophistication and power of bad actors. I don't really know, and I haven't thought about it, about legislation. I can't tell you necessarily. I think it'd be nice to have a federal privacy law in the US, if nothing else, because we don't have to keep track of every state. But I don't know. I just feel like it's like with everything, is a matter of being able to handle and manage things responsibly. So if privacy is a lot about respecting the privacy of the individual and the rights and things like that. So in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to follow the GDPR for companies to be conscious that is something that needs to be done and that they need to care about. I also will have probably a vacation home and unlimited coffee and all kinds of things in my ideal world. But those are not relevant to this.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Well, it's been fantastic to have you on the show. This is really amazing. And I definitely always support all the stuff that you do and the things that you're doing. I'm really proud of all your accolades and the recognition that you're receiving. Then also just, always, what does Victoria have to say about this? So just to know your point of view is really important to me, in my work. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I think the admiration is mutual. I talk about you and I follow you, and you're kind of an icon in the privacy world. And I love it because I think there needs to be more of us, more people like us, women of color, that have those voices. And I appreciate it. And I definitely appreciate the invitation. This is like as close as I've ever been to being famous.
You're definitely famous. Oh my goodness. Well, I'll definitely talk to you soon. And thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.